Hello and welcome to WePC Benchmarks. My name is Seb and today I'm taking a look at the new game Deathloop and benchmarking it with 11 GPUs to see how well it performs. It has just been released by Bethesda and Arcane Studios and is an interesting game but not without apparent hitches in its performance, which many seem to have put blame with the anti-piracy software Deathloop. But from my testing I have not found too many issues, but that just may be down to the settings I've used. Speaking of which, I tested the game on ultra settings with VSync off, which in turn enables the FPS limit cannot be turned off and is only allowed a maximum of 120 FPS. This is likely a game engine limitation, as it has also happened to Dishonored 2, where it was patched in. Nevertheless, let's see how it performs. Well, we start off with the RTX 3090, and at 1080p it averages 114 FPS, with a 1% of 81 and a 0.1% of 7. Moving up, and at 1440p it gives us an average of 113 FPS, with a 1% of 84 and a 0.1% of 12. And then at 4K we get an average of 72 FPS with a 1% of 56 and a 0.1% of 7. Next up is the RX 6900 XT, and at 1080p it averages 116 FPS for 1% of 81 and a 0.1% of 10. And then at 1440p the card averages 108 FPS with a 1% of 65 and a 0.1% of 8. And then at 4K, it averages 70 FPS for 1% of 38 and a 0.1% of 3. The next GPU is the RTX 3080, and at 1080p it averages 111 FPS with a 1% of 1 and a 0.1% of 1 as well. And then at 1440p, the card averages at 106 FPS for 1% of 1 and a 0.1% of 1 as well. And at 4K, it averages 65 FPS with a 1% of 1 and a 0.1% of 1 as well. This is the one card that did have some issues with the big dips, and as you can see, they all tend to be about 1 FPS. Up next is the RX 6800 XT, and at 1080p, it averages 114 FPS with a 1% of 74 and a 0.1% of 4. Moving up to 1440p, and it averages 105 FPS for 1% of 67 and a 0.1% of 20. And then at 4K it averages to 63 FPS with a 1% of 38 and a 0.1% of 4. Then is the RTX 3060 Ti. The card averages 107 FPS at 1080p with a 1% of 37 and a 0.1% of 11. Then up at 1440p the card averages 71 FPS with a 1% of 26 and a 0.1% of 3. Then at 4K it averages to 39 FPS with a 1% of 30 and a 0.1% of 10. The RX 6600 XT is next, and at 1080p it averages 92 FPS with a 1% of 30 and a 0.1% of 8. Moving up to 1440p, the card averages 65 FPS with a 1% of 42 and a 0.1% of 7. Then at 4K, the card averages 33 FPS with 1% of 26 and a 0.1% of 13. Next up is the RTX 2070 Super, and at 1080p it averages at 101 FPS with 1% of 15 and a 0.1% of 3. Moving up to 1440p, and it averages 64 FPS for 1% of 40 and a 0.1% of 8. And then at 4K, it averages 34 FPS with a 1% of 25 and a 0.1% of 8. Moving on to the RX 5700 XT, and at 1080p, it averages 94 FPS with a 1% of 60 and a 0.1% of 9. Then at 1440p, it averages 68 FPS with a 1% of 47 and a 0.1% of 8. And up to 4K, and the game averages 37 FPS for 1% of 15 and a 0.1% of 3. Up next is the RX 580, and at 1080p, it averages 29 FPS with a 1% of 12 and a 0.1% of 4. Up to 1440p, and it averages 14 FPS with a 1% of 8 and a 0.1% of 3. And then at 4K it averages 6 FPS with a 1% of 5 and a 0.1% of 5 as well. The next GPU is the GTX 1050 Ti, and at 1080p it averages 28 FPS with a 1% of 18 and a 0.1% of 7. Moving up to 1440p, it averages 18 FPS with a 1% of 14 and a 0.1% of 5. And then at 4K it averages 9 FPS with a 1% of 6 and a 0.1% of 5. And lastly, we have the GT 1030, and this one I could only manage to get testing done for 1080p, and it just about manages to get 8 FPS average with a 1% of 5 FPS and a 0.1% of 3. So there you have it, Deathloop benchmarked with 11 GPUs. As you can see, up to the 580, you can easily achieve 60 FPS. but anything less and close to their minimum requirements just about hovers around 30. For 4K, you will require the top end cards for a smooth 60 at Ultra. I didn't experience much stuttering and only get drops when the tutorial messages kept popping up, but reading up on it, enabling an FPS cap might be the way forward without VSync, but we'll look into it with our best settings video. So, thanks for watching, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.